I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to The Conversation with Al McFarlane. Today is Thursday, September 8th, 2022. Today, Thursdays, I have friends of mine who hang out, say what's on their mind, talk about anything in the community or in the world. I call us a companions show. And it in part reflects my belief that there are deep and lasting relationships and friendships that are characterized by our ability to be with each other and to share and to agree and disagree and to sharpen our points of view. Well, that's what we do today on The Conversation. I want to acknowledge my writing partner and colleague and kindergarten friend, Brenda Lyle-Gray. Brenda, how you doing? Good to see you.
I'm fine. A sadness with Queen Elizabeth.
What's the latest on that?
No, she passed.
She has passed. I just saw a few minutes ago they were talking about it, but they didn't say that she had passed. They said she was okay.
Yeah, the family, I think Angela Rose put it in the chat as well. The family came off the plane from Scotland, so I think they kind of knew.
Sure. And let's bring Angela in. Angela, how are you, my friend? Good to see you.
Hello, good to see you as well.
Miss Miami.
Today I'm in New York, so I'm calling from New York.
Okay.
Must be rough, girly. Would you say I've earned it with 2 degrees?
Well, I'm still trying to. I have family in New York. My sister's family is here, and I went to college in New York, so
That's great.
It's a bit of a return for me as well.
That is great.
Well, let me bring my special guest in today. Chad Montrie is a historian. He is a professor in the history department at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. And he's the author of 4 books, including The Myth of Silent Spring, Rethinking Origins of America, American Environmentalism, and the one we're talking about today, that book is called Whiteness in Plain View, A History of Racial Exclusion in Minnesota. And when I got this from the University of Minnesota Press, I was fascinated and interested and glad to get it, because as often as not on this program, Al McFarlane is trying to make a point that the things we experience are not new, they're not one of, that they're part of a pattern in practice of exclusion, discrimination, marginalization, and that if we are wise, we have to always operate with that knowledge and operate against the ongoing and ever-present impact, dampening of our opportunity and of our vision and version of progress by systemic structural processes that deny opportunity and that attempt to have us believe in deficiency in us as the reason we experience disparities. Chad, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. Thank you for writing the book. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for inviting me on the show, and hello to everybody.
Well, let's start by letting people know that you're going to be in town here in Minnesota in the next few weeks. Talk about the events coming up, and in doing so, invite all of our listeners and viewers to meet you and to learn about you and to buy your book.
Mm-hmm. So I'm actually going to be coming in on Wednesday. And I'll be going straight down to Austin and doing something there with the whole series that they have for the week. But I'll end the trip in St. Paul at the Minnesota History Center. And actually, the book is with the Minnesota Historical Society Press.
Okay.
And so I'll be coming to the Minnesota History Center, where I did a lot of the research where the archives are, and which is very important in terms of telling the story that you're talking about. So that'll be with Marvin Anderson, who's working with Reconnect Rondo. And so we're going to not focus everything on Rondo, but that'll come up, and he's going to have a lot to say about growing up in Rondo and what's going on now there in terms of the neighborhood and community activism.
Well, let's start with the why. Why did you do this research and write the book? What was the genesis of this work on your behalf?
Mm-hmm. Well, I grew up in Kentucky in a suburb outside of Louisville that was primarily all white with a couple of exceptions. And then I went to grad school. I wrote a article about racial exclusion in Memphis. And then Darren Wilson killed Michael Brown in Ferguson, and protests intensified. And I looked into that, and I realized there's a story of racial exclusion there. So I had all of these sort of ways of thinking about racial exclusion, some of which are personal, some of which are historical, some of which are going on in that immediate moment. And I wanted to get more into that as an historian, but I didn't want to just tell a story about the South, to just once again think of segregation, racial exclusion as a Southern phenomenon. And I talked to some people, including Jim Lowen, who was a historical sociologist, about what would allow me to tell a story about the North, and he immediately said Minnesota. And I really didn't know much about Minnesota before this project.
Why did you suggest Minnesota? Do you know?
He had his own personal ties to it, but also because it really works as something that's, for at least many white people, counterintuitive. They don't think of Minnesota as having a story of racism that's fundamental to the state's history. They think of it as maybe having a progressive reputation for various reasons: Hubert Humphrey, Walter Mondale, Roy Wilkins. And so in telling the story about Minnesota, you're sort of challenging a mythology. That is also something that people across the nation need to know in terms of thinking about and reckoning with a long history of racism that's national, and not just Southern and not just Northern, but also about what we are as a country.
So delve into that, if you would. What is the general perception? I think that you're 1,000% correct. Let me give you a story. One of the activist organizations that I first met with, or people that I first met when I came here, was a brother named Matt Eubanks. Matt Eubanks was like a Black Panther, and he and his brother started a free community school and free breakfast program in the place where the Center for University Research and Outreach is now on Plymouth Avenue. And I interviewed him when I was a student at University of Minnesota. Talked about he and his brothers coming from St. Louis through Wisconsin to downtown Minneapolis. And when they got to Minneapolis, they saw the first Black person they'd seen for a while. Mm-hmm. And they jumped out of the car downtown Hennepin Avenue and said, "Hey, brother," and the brother handshake, "How you doing? What's going on?" And the brother said, "We all from St. Louis." And they said, "Well," he said, "Welcome here, man. This is Minnesota. It's nice, and you can get any white woman you want." Mm-hmm. So the words that came to him from another Black man on downtown Minneapolis were an equation of having access to white women as an equation for freedom. Mm-hmm. And so this myth of Minnesota being a place of access is also deep and personal, and it's within the Black community as well as iterations of it in the white community. So let me have you talk about how that looked and the background from the white side of the equation.
Okay. Well, I mean, I actually would say that one of my favorite lines is I can't remember where this was, maybe a speech he was given in Rochester, New York, and he probably repeated it many times, but he told his audience, stop talking about the South. He said, everything south of the Canadian border is South, and I think it sort of lead with that idea. And Minnesota's got the Canadian border as one of its state borders, right? So I figured if I could go look at different communities across the state at different points in time, I was going to gather a story. And the book isn't comprehensive. I'm not saying that it tells every story, but it also isn't talking about things that are exceptional. I'm not just picking places that are exceptions to some other general, more, racially tolerant or progressive agenda. What I'm trying to do is tell a story that demonstrates or reveals the full array of methods that white people use to keep African Americans from their communities, from their neighborhoods, to remove them if they're there, to keep them out if they've created a white community, a community that is all white. And that is something that changes over time. They use different tools at different moments, and sometimes they're tools that are, sanctioned by the law, and sometimes they're contravening the law. And what I get to by the end, by looking at the different communities, the different cases, is that, as I said at the beginning, like, this is absolutely fundamental to what Minnesota is. That it's not, that I'm not telling sort of a side story, right? That it is Minnesota's story. And there's also a way in which memory plays a part in that as well. I get into how white people sort of layer on the ways that they're actively involved in making white communities, making racial exclusion happen and maintaining it. They also use forgetting, or they come up with sort of twisted ways of explaining why a place is all white, and that's with us still today as well too. And so that's the other part of the book's purpose is to connect past and present, right? If I can line up all of these historical facts, show all of these ways in which white people acted in different communities across 2 centuries, across the state, it explains to us partly, at least, or I want to be part of a conversation that explains how did we get where we are today. And in fact, I was finishing up writing an article for the Minnesota History Magazine about Duluth, because it's the 100th anniversary of the lynchings in Duluth in 2020, and that's when George Floyd was murdered, and the protests were really happening in the summer, and I was editing that with the editor Laura Weber of the magazine. So there was a way that it's inescapable that this book is part of trying to understand the present too.
Walk us through the 2 centuries of Minnesota and highlight the ideas and stories that characterize or shape the conversation that we're having.
Okay. Well, I actually start by looking at the decades before the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 and the years after, because I think of that as really the first racial exclusion, and it's a violent racial exclusion, right? I mean, that is essentially a race war, which is happening, at the same time as the Civil War, which is also about white people trying to maintain what they think of as white supremacy, right? So you have these 2 significant sort of explosions of violence, with white people using violence against, in one case, Native Americans, and in another case, whites fighting whites, as well as African Americans participating to decide whether or not racial slavery is going to last. And I don't really continue telling the story of Native people in Minnesota, but especially for readers who aren't familiar with Minnesota history, I think that I need to tell that as the beginning of what's also going to happen and sort of what is going to be the experience of African Americans, right? Because in fact, that really does set up the context for the post-emancipation migration of Blacks from the South to Minnesota, or the attempts that they make to do that, right? And then I look at different communities like Austin and Duluth. I look at suburbs like Edina. I look at Bloomington. I also look at Rondo, or the area around Rondo in St. Paul, trying to see, what are white people doing at Duluth. I look at suburbs like Edina.
Sorry.
Bloomington.
Oh, my mistake. Go ahead.
That's all right. And so, for instance, in Austin, what happened, some African Americans were moving there after the Civil War. And in 1922, there's a railroad shopman strike. And the company brought in some strike breakers, initially whites, but then also some African Americans. When the African Americans show up, then whites rampage through the city, run them out of town, threatening to harm them. And after that, then a couple months later, they run a Black couple out of town as well from the West End in Austin. And then there's only like a half a dozen of African Americans living in Austin for another 5-6 decades, even as the population increased from like 21,000 to 28,000. That's how Austin became all white. I mean, that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. But it's not just violence. There's other ways that whites do this, and there's racial.
Let's focus on violence to start with, because I think that's part of the perception. The society would have you believe that the violence in the world is violence organized because of deficiencies in Black people, and we pay a lot of attention to urban crime, street crime, youth crime. All are real and all need to be attended to. But the outcome or the overarching message about that is that society as a whole is okay and peace is at hand. And when Black people are experiencing or expressing in their daily lives some sort of violent or malevolent activity, it's their fault. It's not the culture. And that we have normalized or routinized our analysis of the history, and therefore we've either forgotten or excused the violent nature of the presence of the colonist and everything that attends to that. So talk about that whole question of the societal violence, the core violent impetus of the colonizing West, and now that shows up in Minnesota.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's there are these actual manifestations of violence, and then there's the constant threat of violence, right? Always for 2 centuries. And that is, like, as I say, like, it's one part of, I think, a larger, a race war. And when people talk about, class war, race war, they're often flipping it around and saying, working people are trying to, declare a class war, or, the Black nationalists are trying to declare a race war. But this is misunderstanding fundamentally what, puts different people in power, gives people wealth, who are actually there. There's a deep history behind the present society of today, which is fundamentally violent, right? And I mean, these things don't happen accidentally, and that's another thing I try to make clear by going, methodically through each case, is that these are all very purposeful, and they're thought out. And it's actually a lot of work for white people to do this and to maintain whiteness when they achieve it. And eventually, it does crumble here and there because of activists' work, both Black activists as well as white activists. But there is always violence happening, and there's always violence as a threat behind, the fossilized whiteness that people do establish, right? Hopefully, as you pointed out at the beginning, the systemic and structural racism that people face.
Let me bring a couple of more guests in to acknowledge them, and then have you continue. I want to acknowledge, I think I saw Irma Mclaren, Dr. Irma Mclaren. I think she's here on the screen. My colleague,
I'm here.
Hey Irma, my colleague Kamau King, retired attorney in Atlanta, and my colleague Jonathan Palmer, who leads the Hallie Q. Brown Community Center in St. Paul. Everybody committed to community, and all of us, I think, Chad, anxious to have this conversation with you. They will tell you that I've made reference to this again and again and again, because I think it's important that white people hear an analysis that is a critique of them, that they cannot so easily dismiss, the attempt to dismiss our voices all the time. And so our mission is to find people that that are saying the same thing, variations on it, and I believe that that's what your voice represents. Mm-hmm. So, and guys, anybody jump in whenever you want to. Either.
Yeah, this is Dr. Irma, and I apologize for not being on screen, but I'm driving, so you don't want to see that perspective. But I thank you, Chad, for what you're bringing up. Of course, what you've written is not new. Black scholars have been talking about this. We take the Black Wall Streets that were wiped out. I was a professor at the University of Florida, and it had its own version of Tulsa and Austin, which was Rosewood, where they burned out and chased out and killed black people. And we have to understand that at the basis of this, and this is not individual, whiteness as a concept, and white supremacy is a concept that can be manifested through individuals, but it also is structural and systemic. So if all the white people disappeared tomorrow, you'd still have white supremacy if we've not unpacked or dismantled those systems, right? And so one of the things that I think people need to understand is that this is a battle over resources. And there is such rage among whites who, when they see Blacks making it and achieving, it fosters such rage that the oppression of Native Americans is not simply about, biological racism and the concept of, inferior people. It is also rooted in land acquisition, that Native people had access to resources that white people wanted, and they will get them by any means necessary. And I think the same thing I was just reading a story about a Black family in California that just required the title back to the beachfront that they owned, that the city had taken by eminent domain, given to the county, because they wanted that beachfront for themselves, and basically took it illegally. Not everybody's going to get those reparations, but there's a lot owed to Black people because we worked for that. We were able to build wealth, and then it was taken away illegally, politically, sometimes using the means of the justice system, and sometimes just by sheer violence, literally murdering people. So I think it's, what you're saying is important. I think it adds to the cacophony of voices that have already told this story. Unfortunately, for us is that people may not believe it if Black people say it, but if a white man says it, they may believe it. So we need to have allies who are willing to step out and say that. So thank you for your work.
Let me take a minute, and this is what I've shared a dozen times, Chad, the notes on the back of your book. Whiteness in Plain View examines the ways white residents across Minnesota acted to intimidate, control, remove, and keep out African Americans over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. Their methods ranged from anonymous threats, vandalism, and mob violence to restrictive housing covenants, realtor deceit, and mortgage discrimination. And they were aided by local, state, and federal government agencies, as well as openly complicit public officials. What they did was not an anomaly or aberration in some particular place or passing moment, but rather common and continuous. Chapter by chapter, the book shows that Minnesota's overwhelming whiteness is neither accidental nor incidental, and that racial exclusion's legacy is very much woven into the state's contemporary politics, economy, and culture. I think that's a mouthful, and that's one of the things I hope people will take away, that again, this is not incidental or accidental. This is planful, willful, intentional, and existing still in the relationships between white people in power and Black people and lack of power in Minnesota. Chad, go ahead.
Yeah, and I would just adding to that and what you said, Dr. Irma, like I think that it does look at the 19th century, but it brings the story into the 20th century, and it gets us close to the end of the 20th century. And I don't say it in the book, but I'm not arguing that Africans should go live in a neighborhood that is hostile to them. If white people have practiced racial exclusion there, that what we need to do is have everybody live together, and that's going to produce harmony. What I'm trying to argue is that the racial exclusion was white people monopolizing things, right? There was resources that they were monopolizing by doing racial exclusion, and in that way, the corollary to that is that African Americans being denied things as a result, right? And including being able to build generational wealth, and that is part of the explanation behind a lot of disparities that we see in the 21st century, right? And so, and this is not, there is a longer history, and some of the people that are part of the story in the 19th and early 20th century obviously not with us, but there's a history that is more recent, and some of those people are still around, and I actually want to make the case that there's a responsibility that they have, not only for truth telling, but also in terms of reparations. That this is that no one can sort of step aside. White people can't step aside by claiming they weren't involved, because actually this tells you the story of how very much complicated people are as individuals in some cases, but also as a group.
Have any of you heard that before? Somebody, Dr. Irma or Angela, Jonathan, where whites in our community, in our circles, say that not their fault, my hands are clean, I wasn't involved, I didn't do it? Have you heard that?
Absolutely. That is what we call white racial innocence, where people, want to pretend. First, white people in America have a tremendous capacity for historic amnesia. Right? They love to forget stuff. And that's part of why this whole movement, legislative and politically, to remove certain information from history books, is that it fills in and makes possible white racial innocence. So people can pretend, I didn't know, I wasn't there, it wasn't me, it wasn't my family, I came from poor farmers. But even poor white people have benefited from these kinds of things. So absolutely, that has been a pattern in this culture.
Al, I think the more likely question is, who hasn't had that in their circle? I think everybody on this broadcast is going to have somebody in their circle, and you have those conversations, and you try to be patient as somebody says, I didn't have anything to do with this, I wasn't a part of this, and they do not realize how much they have benefited and how pervasive. One of the great examples that I like to use is explaining to people that during segregation, Black people paid taxes for pools that they couldn't use, for buses they had to sit in the back of, for roads that they weren't allowed to, work on. There is a whole easy line to benefits that African Americans, other people of color have paid for through blood, sweat, and tears, or taxes, or other means, and have not been able to enjoy the benefits from. And so when you're talking about the idea of reparations, when you're talking about who has to take responsibility, a good point to show is the disparity that exists in so many different ways that people don't even look at it. They're thinking of this in terms of giant cash payouts, and they're not understanding the education that was denied. They're not understanding the access that was denied. If you look back at how long it took universities to desegregate, and then take a look at how many people have a college education and have that ability, it shows you how far people of color, and Black people especially, have been held back and have been denied access to the resources that white people have had for so long.
And
even
also,
our institutions, HBCUs, public HBCUs that were established because white institutions would not let Blacks in, they have been underfunded because we don't have the generational wealth. We've not been able to support the private ones, and they're still lacking in infrastructure because of generations of disparities.
And I would say, going back to Dr. Montrie's point too, as to Minnesota, as to why is it that nobody examines the racial history, the racial violent history of places like Minnesota, is again to Dr. Irma's point, this white racialized innocence isn't just a case of saying, okay, well, we didn't do it, but also when they're in all white spaces, not interrogating those spaces, right? And not, it's this thing that Dr. Irma Mclaren says, and goes from, being just passively accepting this racist world to being actively anti-racist. And to be actively anti-racist, you have to interrogate white spaces, because the goal of white supremacy is to create white spaces. So in my mind, white supremacy failed in the South more than it failed in the North. Actually, white supremacy succeeded really well in Minnesota, so much so that it became in 1980 almost a 80%, 89% white state. Right. And that's the goal of white supremacy. And so instead of interrogating it as saying, OK, just the South has racism, you have to say, actually, racism works so well in Minnesota, it almost succeeded. And it continues to almost succeed in trying to wipe out Black and American Indian and folks of color populations that do come here.
Chad, you document the collusion, the pattern and practice of collusion of those in power, of whites, both elected and public officials, I think you say, but the creation of public policy, exclusionary policy, as a system and way of life. I'm suggesting that you are putting a light on how, as Angela was just saying, effectively Minnesota did that.
Yeah, but it also we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about this with Marvin Anderson when I come to St. Paul next week. I'm talking about Rondo, and I know Jonathan Palmer. I imagine this is something you're talking about all the time, right? What happened in Rondo, which is a story of policy, and it's not just the freeway, right? It was also two, and then later a third urban renewal project. In fact, there were urban renewal projects happening that were causing displacement even before the highway construction. But that was displacing both Black residents and white residents, right? One of the things that's interesting about Rondo is not only was it the place where you have the largest population of African Americans, but it was an integrated community, probably the most integrated community in the Twin Cities. And so whites as well as Blacks were displaced by public policy. But what happened to African Americans was different, right? Because they also faced white prejudice. So when they tried to go and find new apartments, a new house, they were blocked, and effectively they're getting concentrated in a smaller and smaller area. They're segregated even more than they were before. And so it's very complicated. I mean, I like to think that the other thing that the book does is show that there's not really one explanation for why we have racial exclusion ever, even in one place in one particular moment of time. And white prejudice is something you have to reckon with. And it's easy to point out that now I think there's a lot of scholars who are trying to pay attention to how the state was implicated in making racial exclusion happen, because that helps us make the case for reparations, right? If the state's responsible, then we can say the state's also responsible for reparations. But it isn't just the state. It isn't just policy. There are other ways that white people, even sometimes, in sort of acting against what the state has declared is sort of the new law, that they're still maintaining racial exclusion. So, for instance, Minnesota passed a fair housing law in 1961 that went into effect in 1962, and white people continue to keep African Americans out of their neighborhoods, even though it violates the law, right, for another decade and a half, 2 decades, maybe even into the 21st century if you look in certain places, right? So they use the state, they use racial covenants, they use the fact there's no protection for fair housing, but then when racial covenants are declared unconstitutional, or at least not enforceable, when states pass laws, the federal government passes a law for fair housing, white people still have other tools that they fall back on, right? And all of that has to be reckoned with in terms of telling the truth and getting past this historical amnesia that you mentioned, Dr. Irma. And that only when we have that full complicated story, I think, can we really understand what reparations might look like. And it's not just economic, also, as you pointed out, Jonathan, that there's cultural reparations, political reparations, social reparations, all kinds of reparations that have to be included in the movement.
Chad,
And it should not just be the state that actually makes reparations. We have institutions like newspapers. I don't know if you've seen it, but the Baltimore Sun issued a public apology stating how it had been complicit and deliberately fueled race hatred. I know that the News and Observer here in Raleigh, North Carolina, there's a PBS series in which, again, they say that they were very deliberate and intentional, in fueling race hatred and racial conflict. The same with the Chicago Tribune from my hometown. So there are also institutions that owe reparations because they were so complicit in fostering this. And more recently, let us not forget the banks, Wells Fargo, there may be others that were complicit in the mortgage foreclosures. When I was the founding executive director at UROC, 56% of all the mortgage foreclosures that happened in the city of Minneapolis happened in the 3 zip codes of North Minneapolis. 56%. That is the same pattern, according to community members there like Sherry Pugh, who were there, who said when there was also the previous mortgage, crisis that happened in the 1980s, again, North Minneapolis was disproportionately impacted. So we have institutions like newspapers, banks that were complicit in making sure that this sort of white public space, racialized public space, maintains itself.
I mean, if you're going to really go into it, I mean, the presence of land grant institutions like the University of Minnesota, which was one of the largest land grant institutions in the U.S., also needs to be recognized, as they had land in California, right? They had land not just in the state of Minnesota, but sold to folks in South Carolina during while slavery was legal. So, the University of Minnesota was selling land and selling profits, in general to folks who own slaves, right? And it's very well known too in the beginning of the state's history that there were slaves at Fort Snelling, right? And so there's a long history of not just institutions, but how can we tangle with this now when we're uncovering this history? And this can go to you, Dr. Irma, and to you, Dr. Montrie, of we are in a place where we're very unsure of how to reckon with our own present, as a country. How do we put forward these ideas that are seemingly radical and seemingly, wanting to address the past in a way that actually fully does the reparations, but also fully does the reconciliation as well in that healing aspect? What are some of the things that from both of y'all's studies and expertise that you could help guide us in?
Before we get to that, I need to tag back in on Dr. Montre's point because he mentioned a piece.
Chad, hold on, Jonathan. Chad, I was going to ask you to also, in responding, talk about whether we serve our purposes by defaulting to institutional failures. Ought we examine persons, people, thought leaders, decision makers, and how they shaped and used and created structures that enabled their worldview, that worldview being personal gain wrapped up under the cloak of supremacy. So, Chad, go ahead, Jonathan. What's your compliment?
I just wanted to tag on to the end of Dr. Montre's piece about Rondo, which was that we had a lot of families, Jewish families that were here. And a few years ago, we had a reunion of Jewish and African-American descendants of Rondo that had not seen each other in 40 years. And the Jewish families, African Americans, weren't allowed in many places to own land. So Jewish families would buy the homes and sell it to African American families on a contract for deed. So there was a lot of linkage together. But when the time came for the development projects, when the displacement started to happen, Jewish families had more access. White families had more access, and African Americans did not have as much to be able to move into other communities. And then when you look at things like the FHA loans, $120 billion in that, less than 2% went to non-whites in the time of that. So it is a large problem that has been structurally and systemically disenfranchising African Americans and people of color.
Chad?
Okay, there's a lot of threads going on here. Very, very, very interesting. I think another thing that I wanted to do in the book, and maybe this is just maybe how I work as an historian, is to get some of the details right, including individualizing what happened, and not thinking of everything as just being the result of a group or a mob, even in some cases. Like in Duluth, for instance, I'm still sort of shocked that. Well, I guess I shouldn't be shocked, but surprised that you have these photographs of the lynching, right, with people standing around, murdered men, very clearly identifiable, and we don't know their names. The people don't. And when they tell the story of the lynching, it's about how a mob did it, right? But yes, there was a mob, but there were also these people that lived in town, and it's somebody's grandparents, it's somebody's uncles. These people are known, right? And later on in the 1960s, I try to bring the Duluth story forward in time when Matthew Carter and his wife Helen, they tried to build a house on London Road in what had been up to that point all white community. Neighbors file a petition to stop them from getting a permit, and they put their names on the petition, right? And so I make it clear in the book, like these are individual people. I put their names in the footnotes, at least I think. When I did a talk in Duluth, I put the petition up on a screen because I want people to know that there's real people that did this, right? And some of these people maybe even are still alive. And that's part of the truth and reconciliation model, right? When this happened in South Africa, people had to tell stories about what happened, like, and who was involved and who is actually to blame. creating this abstract, white community or group of white people that also sort of has responsibility only gets us so far, I think. And it also helps make the case for reparations to tell the story with the specifics in it. And it also makes it harder for people to challenge it, right? I think one of the reasons why people talk about critical race theory so much in trying to, fight back against the Black Lives Matter movement and what people are doing with that is because theory, I think they in their minds is questionable. But if I tell historical facts, things that are proven by evidence, sources that I get from archives, it's hard for them to argue with that, right? And if we have the facts, that's not radical in the sense that it is part of some kind of ideology. It is radical in the way that it upsets the world that they think is true, right? But it is true what I'm saying. Like if someone wants to challenge my book, they can do it, but they have to have evidence that is somehow going to work contrary to the evidence that I have. Right? I'm not just making this up. It's not a fiction.
Bill O'Dell put comments in the chat saying that reparations have been paid over and over again in the form of welfare. Remember the Great Society, and he goes on to say that the only thing that's systematic is everyone calling everyone else racist, when in fact those that do are racist themselves. What about that, Chad? That's kind of a common response. What do you say about that?
Well, I got out of graduate school in 2001 at a PhD, and I've been doing, something like American history for 20 years. And I thought I had a good sense of, I learned from new and social historians, what we call the new social historians of the 1960s and 70s, people who are tied to a lot of the social movements of the 20th century, and they brought that activism with them into colleges and universities. And so they were telling a story that is, looking at American history from the bottom up. And I thought I knew a lot about American history from that perspective, but I was surprised how pervasive and intention and just continuous racial exclusion is in Minnesota from decade to decade, and what implications that has for how it shapes the present. That it's just so unavoidable. Like that, the present is essentially a product of this, and I don't know. It's to me when I think about it, when I look at sections of the book, if I have to do a talk or something, like I'm kind of overwhelmed by the weight of it. Like it's just inescapable. And so I don't know, comments like that. I don't really understand them anymore. They don't make sense to me, knowing what I do know about Minnesota history.
Brenda, you had a question, and Kamau, jump in, please. Brenda?
Okay. Mr. Montrie, I have two questions. Number one, I wanted to know about the backlash, the white backlash that you have been having with your book. And then what are the possibilities that a book like yours could be used at the university level?
Well, I haven't fortunately experienced much. There were a couple little things that happened that, but nothing really serious or significant. I mean, I do think books like this are part of, I haven't yet been called out specifically, but books like this are what people who are part of the, there's, groups like No Left Turn in Education and others that are questioning what they call critical race theory, right? And, legislation that states are trying to enact to basically, make it impossible to teach some parts of American history. That's kind of what they're kind of talking about, things like this, right? They're talking about a book like Whiteness in Plain View. But I haven't experienced much of it personally. I do think it's getting already adopted, from what I can tell, by different people in colleges and universities. But it's also something that the people in communities that are trying to do truth and reconciliation have also adopted. I know in Hastings there's a great effort. They have a website for this building for remembrance and reconciliation effort there. And I'm not the first person to tell the Hastings story. but I added to it. There's James Curry and some other people are working on sort of building that out. Heidi Langenfeld, who's the archivist at Hastings, they're bringing the book in as one of the other tools that they use in terms of the community work that white people as well as African Americans are doing to try to tell the past, to try to like reckon with the past, and then sort of figure out what they're going to now do in the 21st century. So
in the political climate that we have today, are you not surprised that the people that really need to read your book will probably ignore it?
Yeah, although I mean, I have to say, one of the things that I was surprised about the Black Lives Matter movement is obviously Black activists were on the front lines of that, but there were a lot of white people out there that I was surprised how and it wasn't like there was a gradual version of this. Like suddenly there are white people on the streets, Black people getting arrested, beaten, shot, jailed, and I don't know how to explain that yet. I think we still have to have some distance to figure out where did those white people come from. And I hear white people tell me this book is important to them too, in terms of helping them do the rethinking they need to do.
And the Lakotas, they showed up. I mean, shoulder to shoulder especially with the rally after the day after the murder, and they just flocked right there, thousands of them. So,
come on, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Chad. What forms of reparations do you see possible, and how do we get there?
Well, I think there's some immediate things that can happen. For instance, you can address land use zoning, which was a tool that white people began to use when segregation laws were overruled with the Buchanan versus Worley decision in the teens, as restrictive housing covenants are no longer enforceable by state courts. Land use zoning became more popular because it seems like it's not racist, right? That it doesn't have race as part of its operating directions, but it is. That's what it is, and we could address land use zoning to go to places where there is a ban on multi-use housing or multi-family housing, and that would begin to affect a change in who gets to live in these communities. Wouldn't just be affecting African Americans, obviously, but it would help a lot. But I think there's things like that, and then beyond that, I feel like this is a question that I find difficult to answer. Although I appreciate the question, but I want to just be part of the movement that's working toward that, and I don't know what those reparations will look like. I mean, I just feel like I've told the story in the book, and now I just join the collective effort that includes a lot of different activists from places that, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's for me to say what those reparations should be. In fact, probably not.
Chad, before we're done, I'd like you to take, if you mentally prepare for it, a chapter, a section of the book that you'd like to read, something that you think really illuminates either the parts of this conversation or the discoveries you made as a researcher, writer in preparing the book. So I'd love to hear your voice. When I read it, I heard my voice, but curious as to how it sounded coming from you as well. So think about that if you would. If there's a passage or a part of a chapter that you want to read, I'd like you to do that. Angela, feedback. What are your thoughts?
Yes, no, I'm really happy to hear, from Professor Montrie, and then also, this is absolutely a field that I think that we all need to. It's not even a field; it's a topic that has to be examined through different fields, from historical lenses, from economic lenses. My father, Dr. Samuel Myers, he talks about the Minnesota paradox through economic and then historical economic lens. But even just the case of Hastings, I remember last year, 2 years ago, right when I was just became the president of the Minneapolis NAACP, I wrote an article for my college in New York City, right, Barnard Magazine, about Hastings, Minnesota, about the history of white opportunity hoarding and racial exclusion in Minnesota. And things of just saying, like, there was these are well-known, like, community facts, right? There were 2 Klan presses, right, in Minnesota that we can name, right? There was the issue in Hastings that happened where, you know, there was an alleged arson that really impacted that Black community. Just things like that. It was wild to me to write that in an article and to present to this newspaper, which is a college newspaper, right? A college magazine. And they come back to me and they said, we need the facts. We couldn't find any Klans in Minnesota. And I said, look, I'll cut that because I know I have to really find it, right? It's there. And I did spend some time in getting those citations, right? But it takes time. And so having the historical citation in a book that really we can get into the cultural knowledge, the cultural, awareness of our state is important. It's not just for the case of what we're trying to make for the future, but it's just because these are the historical facts. And until we can really get it where people know these citations, where it's not just like you have to go to the University of Minnesota or the Minnesota Historical Press and go through the documents or go through the side magazines, or actually a lot of Black newspapers have fantastic records on, the history of Minnesota and also some of the things that are happening in Minnesota. A lot of the AA Lee happenings in Minneapolis NAACP with Lena O. Smith, that you could see records in some Black newspapers, right, in the 1930s and 40s. So, or even that's important, but it's hard as an activist now, if you don't have that historical research background, to know exactly where to go to get your citations, to be seen as an authority, to have the legitimacy to make these claims for policy changes in the present. So that's, my response is I'm always happy when there's more and more research done to bring the educational awareness, the cultural awareness to these issues. Because as an activist, I'm trying to say these things. And I say these things at my speeches, right? I talk about genocide. I talk about the Dakota Wars. I talk about what happened in Mankato. I talk about, different things in my speeches that people's eyes might glaze over, or they might say, oh, she's just a crazy activist. She's just up there yelling anyway. But to be seen as bringing a legitimate argument already as a Black activist, you're working from a lower status, right, than if I had a PhD, right? But hopefully I'm working towards that, right? I can't say anything if it'll happen, but I'm working towards it. But that's what we're trying to get toward. We're trying to get these actions, and you can't do it without having a historical fact to back you up in this moment.
Chad, are there some characters that loom large, both in the white and Black side in your story? I was flipping through the index as Angela was speaking, and I started off with the story about the Eubanks boys Eubanks men coming to Minnesota in their station wagon back in the 60s. But you got a section here that addresses interracial marriage and families as a concern in integration, and you reference those things are discussed on page 126, 178, and 184. You say any die on certain pages in Minnesota, certain pages, objections to it. You have a comment on racial purity and interracial marriage in St. Louis Park. So this is wonderful documentation and citation, I think. Are there, when you look at your index, stories of people that jump out at you?
Well, one of the people that I admire and a great deal, and I was very glad to see that he could see his story in the book as well as in print in an article, is Matt Carter, and his wife died some years ago, Helen. They are part of the story of Duluth in the rest of the 20th century, right? Often when you think of Duluth, you sort of think of the lynching history, and that's the end of the story of racism there, right? Or at least people just don't know much about what happened after. But I take this story into the 1960s, and Matt and Helen, they came from Mississippi to Chicago and then to Duluth in 1960. Matt was working on lake boats, and he was working out of Two Harbors because he couldn't get a job out of Duluth, right? The racist hiring halls, the union halls, prohibited Black residents from working out of the Duluth halls. So he's over there. His wife, Helen, ends up being the first African-American to teach in the Duluth school system. Up to the point where she showed up, there were no African-American teachers in the school system. And then he decided to buy this house, buy land, which they have to buy using a white buyer. A local reverend, a local minister buys the property for them because the owner of the property refused to sell it to Matt and Helen. And Matt is in his 90s. And when I went to Duluth to do the talk last April, he showed up, and he's still like full energy. And as far as I know, nobody had at least published anything about his story before. And he definitely was, glad to see it. And there are many people like Matt in the state of Minnesota, in its history, whose stories are very important and probably not yet known widely, right? But I'm hoping that this book will move some of that forward.
Did you pull together a piece that you can read in your voice, Chad?
Yeah, this is the end of the introduction, and it kind of sums up a little bit about a lot of what we've been talking about. Most importantly, however, this book is meant to demonstrate that Minnesota's overwhelming whiteness is neither accidental nor incidental, and that racial exclusion's legacy is very much interwoven in the state's contemporary politics, economy, and culture. Over the many years that I've been writing Whiteness, friends, colleagues, and strangers have asked me what I was working on. When I told them, their next question invariably was, why Minnesota? A few were asking why I should study that state instead of any other. Most of the white people, though, were asking, even if they did not fully understand what they were doing, why are you studying a state that, because it's so far north, because it's associated with baked-in cultural pleasantry like Minnesota Nice, because there are so few people of color there, which is a paradox, has no real history of racism. Even now, after George Floyd's murder and the public protests it ignited, many readers will be surprised that racial hatred and racial inequality have been such a fundamental part of Minnesota's past. But Whiteness in Plain View is its own answer to the hidden question, and the larger significance of the book is grounded in that fact. It reveals the way long-standing assumptions about regional distinctions based on race are off the mark, if not a lie, and that raises fundamental questions about the country as a whole. The ghosts of racial exclusion, to return to Avery Gordon's metaphor, are all around us. If they are in Minnesota, they are everywhere, wherever we are.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, we got about a minute or two left. I want to ask all of our participants to give a final thought, maybe share what else they're reading. And at the end, I want to ask you, Chad Montrie, to invite people to your events next week again. Kamau?
Yeah, I just wanted to tell Angela that those white spaces, they're still being formed here in Georgia. There's a movement of white people to the north, but I don't think they can get away because there's so many Black and brown people who are in Georgia that, we live in every place. But they're still trying to build the white spaces, and the infrastructure is following them. I mean, they're building highways that way, and, so it's still happening.
Jonathan? Final comment or impression?
Yep, just had to unmute. Chad, thank you. Al is the one who hit me to the book, so I'm starting to read it. I'm really appreciating it and the information. I love data. I love information. I've been laughing a little bit as I've read the comments that have been going on with this, because the blatant ignorance that goes forward in understanding what reparations means, what has happened in our country, and the fact that there has never been a full and fair accounting of slavery, of segregation, of the impact all the way around. And it is the confidence that you see when racist people go ahead and promote their own ideology. It is something that we often have to laugh at because it is so absurd, and it goes into that far extreme. And the fact that we can put actual truth out and facts and data, that's the beauty of going ahead and being able to educate the public and going ahead to build a better society that understands what really happened, what still is happening, and what needs to be done to actually address the issue versus the window dressing. So, Chad, thank you so much for this book, and I'm really excited to continue on with it.
Brenda, then Angela.
I just want to thank you, Chad. I just hope we get to a point where truth and reconciliation will happen, and especially for our young people. I'm really concerned about our children because they ask why, and we don't have a lot of answers because it's not being taught in school.
Angela, what are your thoughts?
Yes, no, I think two books that I was thinking about during this conversation is From Here to Equality by William Darity and Kirsten Mullen, which is two folks out of Duke University. And they discuss from an economics and historical point of view, reparations for slavery, and specifically federal reparations for slavery. And we have to be specific in what we're saying reparations for, because this word reparations is not something that was just invented by Black folk. You know, this is actually out of human rights frameworks and international frameworks. So the word reparations is not without a context. And I just wanted to point that out, that this was not something that just appeared one day and gained traction. This is reparations is a fundamental part of truth and reconciliation processes and healing processes.
Name of the book again?
Yes, From Here to Equality.
Okay, here. Okay.
From Here to Equality by William Darity and Kirsten Mullen from Duke University. And then also Hope in the Struggle by Josie Johnson, which is Josie Johnson, a community activist leader who really pushed the Housing Equality Act in the 1960s in Minnesota. Really fantastic woman. And she's a mentor of mine. So her biography. So those are two resources I would love to give to folks.
Angela, thank you so much. Chad, I'm going to close with you. Thank you for being here. First of all, thank you for the work you've done, that you continue to do. Please invite people to show up and engage in the next few days when you're going to be in town.
Well, thank you for letting me be part of the conversation. It was great to be part of the comments going on. And I'm going to be in Minnesota. I'm going to talk first in Boston on Thursday, which I think is the 15th. Then I'll be in Mankato doing a talk at the university there on Friday. And I'll be in St. Paul at the Minnesota History Center on Saturday. And that talk, I think, begins at 11 o'clock. And Marvin Anderson will be there as well. We'll be talking a lot about Rondo, including, I'm sure we'll talk about Josie Johnson, because she almost single-handedly finally got the fair housing law passed in Minnesota. And it's in the context of what was taking place in Rondo, right? So she will come up for sure. And we can continue the conversation on.
Okay, listen, thanks. This has been a wonderful discussion. Thanks to all of you. Thanks those who are listening, watching, those who had comments. We appreciate that. I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. We'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.